The thick cream envelope lay on her otherwise immaculate desk. It was an island of stark simplicity in a sea of organized case files. There was no return address. Only the Blackwood ducal seal pressed into dark blue wax. Her heart did not so much beat faster as it seemed to stop altogether for a moment. She knew what this was. The summons. The final test she had been dreading since the day she took her father's chair. Her fingers, usually so steady, trembled slightly as she used a letter opener to slice through the wax. The paper inside was heavy, almost like card, and impossibly white. The message itself was an exercise in brutal brevity, written in a severe, slanting hand with ink as black as a raven's wing. It was just one sentence. Be at Blackwood Manor tomorrow at 10 in the morning to discuss the Tidwell boundary dispute. It was signed simply Alistair Beaumont, not His Grace the Duke of Blackwood, not even a formal closing, just his name, as if the name itself were a title, an edict that required no further embellishment. It was a dismissal before the meeting had even begun, an assertion of raw power that made her feel small, like a junior clerk being called into a headmaster's office. It was a message that said, I am the Duke, and you are a temporary nuisance. Eleanor Vance read the single line 3 times. With each reading, the words felt colder, sharper, etching themselves into her mind. She had officially taken over her father's firm, Vance and Cumberbush Solicitors, 2 months ago. Ever since her father, the brilliant Thomas Vance, had been struck down by a sudden, devastating illness, she had lived in a state of managed dread. She knew this day would come. The Duke of Blackwood was not just any client. He was their most important client. His family's vast and complex accounts had been with Vance and Company for over a century. Losing him would be more than a financial blow. It would be a catastrophic failure, a public declaration that she was not her father's equal. She closed her eyes, and her mind conjured the Duke's face from the one time she had seen him years ago. It had been at a firm function, a celebration of her father's 40th year at the bar. Alistair Beaumont had been a tall, severe figure with shoulders as broad as a castle door and eyes the color of a winter sky. He had looked through her then, a young woman barely out of university, as if she were part of the wallpaper. She had no doubt he still saw her that way. A woman, an interloper, an inconvenience in a world built by and for men like him. A surprising wave of anger, hot and sharp, cut through the cold fear. She would not be dismissed. She would not let him dismantle her father's entire life's work with a single arrogant flick of his pen. She was not just Thomas Vance's daughter, a pale imitation of the great man. She was a solicitor in her own right, top of her class, with a mind as sharp as anyone in her father's firm. Perhaps, she thought with a defiant inner spark, even sharper. That night, the grandfather clock in the main office seemed to tick with unusual force. Each heavy tock was a hammer blow, marking the inexorable approach of her judgment. The familiar, comforting hum of London was a distant murmur beyond the thick panes of glass. Inside Vance & Company, there was only the sacred quiet, the scent of old paper, worn leather, and the beeswax polish the cleaner used on the mahogany. Eleanor sat at her father's enormous desk, the one he had commanded for 4 decades. It still felt too big for her, a king's throne she was merely borrowing, hoping no one would notice. Under the warm, focused glow of the green-shaded lamp, she worked. The Tidwell boundary dispute was not a simple case. It was a snarled knot of history, precedent, and pride stretching back more than 200 years. With methodical precision, she spread out the documents. Ancient, brittle maps with faded ink that threatened to crumble at a touch. Deeds written on vellum in an elaborate looping script that was almost a work of art. Stacks of correspondence between previous dukes and previous generations of Vances, their arguments and agreements echoing down the years. The entire history of the Blackwood Estate's southern border was laid out before her, a puzzle of paper and ink. Her father had taught her to see the story within the law, to find the human element, the passions and prejudices tangled in the dry legal jargon. She traced the lines of the contested land with the tip of her finger. On the map, it was a useless strip of marsh, barely fit for grazing a few sheep. But to the Tidwell family, who had farmed the adjacent land for centuries, and more importantly, To the Duke of Blackwood, it was a matter of principle, of honor, of not yielding a single inch of ancestral ground. She read until her eyes burned and the words began to blur. She memorized dates, names, obscure local bylaws from the 18th century that no one had likely thought about since they were written. And then she found it. Tucked away in the parliamentary records of the late 19th century, she found a precedent in a case from 1888. It was a ruling on riparian rights, the rights concerning a riverbank, that every previous council, including her own firms, had apparently missed. A tiny electric thrill went through her, chasing away some of the exhaustion. It was a key, a small, almost invisible key, but one that could potentially unlock the entire dispute. It shifted the legal foundation of the Duke's claim from shaky ground to solid rock. The Tidwell claim became almost irrelevant in its light. She began to make notes, her own handwriting neat and precise, a stark contrast to the sprawling, confident signatures of dukes and lawyers who was long dead. The office was utterly silent, save for the whisper of paper as she turned a page and the distant, melodic chime of the clock marking 3 in the morning. In that deep silence, she could almost feel the weight of all those men, all those Vances who had sat in this chair before her. She was the first woman, the first one who had to prove she even had the right to be here at all. The fear was a constant, cold presence at the base of her spine. It was a familiar companion these last few months. What if she failed? What if the Duke listened to her brilliant, carefully constructed argument? His cold eyes filled with that same dismissive disdain, and then simply took his business to a firm run by a man. The thought was a physical ache in her chest. It would break her father's heart, what was left of it to be broken. It would be the end of everything he had built. Before leaving for Kent in the morning, she went to him. The air in his grand bedroom, once filled with the scent of his cigars and expensive cologne, was now heavy with the sterile smell of medicine and sickness. The vibrant, powerful man who had taught her to ride a bicycle and parse a contract was gone. In his place was a frail figure, lost in a vast sea of white pillows and sheets. His once sharp gray eyes, the same shade as her own, were clouded with pain, but they flickered with recognition as she quietly entered and approached his bed. "Elena," he whispered, his voice a dry, rasping shadow of its former commanding tone. She sat on the edge of the mattress, careful not to jostle him, and took his hand. It felt impossibly thin and cool, the bones as delicate as a bird's wing beneath the papery skin. This hand had once been so strong, capable of calming her childhood fears with a single firm touch. "I'm going to Blackwood Manor," she said, forcing her voice to be steady and bright. "A performance for his benefit. To see the Duke." A flicker of the old fire, the keen legal mind, returned to his eyes. He knew exactly what this meant. He squeezed her hand, a faint, papery pressure that was the most he could manage. "The Tidwell case," he rasped, his breath catching. "It's all about the water rights, not the fence line. Everyone always looks at the fence line." Eleanor's heart leaped with a surge of love and pride. Even now, even like this, his mind was a fortress. He had seen it too. Of course he had. "The 1888 repeal," she said softly, leaning closer. A weak, tired smile touched his lips. "My girl," he breathed, the words barely audible but carrying the weight of his entire world. "My clever girl." Tears pricked the back of her eyes, hot and sudden, but she refused to let them fall. She could not cry, not in front of him. She had to be his strength now, his proxy in the world. "I will handle it, Father," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. "I will make you proud." He closed his eyes, already exhausted by the brief exchange. As she stood to leave, her gaze fell on his nightstand. Beside a glass of water and a bottle of pills lay his fountain pen. It was a heavy, black, lacquered pen with a solid gold nib, its surface worn smooth and comfortable from decades of use. He had signed every important document of his life with that pen. It was an extension of his will, his formidable intellect. On a sudden impulse, she picked it up. The weight was familiar, solid and comforting in her palm. It was real. It was a tangible piece of the father she remembered, the giant who had dominated every room he entered. Without a second thought, she slipped it into the inner pocket of her briefcase. It felt like taking a piece of him with her, a secret weapon, a talisman against the cold arrogance she was about to face. The journey from London to Kent was a descent into another world, another time. The carriage left the city's familiar, bustling streets behind, its wheels rattling over cobblestones and then settling into a steady rhythm on the smoother country roads. The tidy suburbs gave way to rolling green fields, then to dense, ancient woodlands that crowded the road. The sky, which had been a hazy, unassuming gray over the city, turned a deeper, more ominous shade. A fine, persistent drizzle began to fall, streaking the windows and blurring the landscape into a watercolor of greens and browns. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her back straight against the leather seat, her hands folded over the briefcase on her lap. She could feel the solid, reassuring shape of the pen inside. She rehearsed her opening statement in her mind, editing and polishing the words. She reviewed the key points of her argument, numbering them for clarity. She imagined the Duke's cold stare and practiced holding his gaze in her mind's eye until her own eyes ached. She was prepared. She was more than prepared. She knew this case better than anyone on earth, but her preparation felt like a thin layer of armor against an overwhelming force. This was not a battle of legal minds alone. It was a battle of worlds. Her world of merit, logic, and relentless hard work against his world of inherited power, rigid tradition, and unshakable self-assurance. He was a duke. He did not have to prove his worth to anyone. His was a given, bestowed at birth. Hers had to be earned, minute by excruciating minute, in the face of his open skepticism. The landscape grew wilder, more desolate. The trees were stark and black against the gray sky, their branches like skeletal fingers. Stone walls covered in dark green moss snaked over the bleak, windswept moors. There was a raw, untamed beauty to it, but it was a cold beauty, unwelcoming. A land that did not care for visitors. Then she saw it. The carriage rounded a sharp bend in the road, and Blackwood Manor appeared, rising from the mist like a jagged rock. It was not a house. It was a fortress, an imposing Gothic revival estate of dark gray stone, bristling with towers and turrets that clawed at the oppressive sky. It seemed to have grown from the very rock of the moor, a monument to centuries of ducal power and grim endurance. The dozens of windows were dark, like vacant eyes, watching her approach with cold indifference. Her breath caught in her throat. The sheer scale of the place was an act of intimidation. It was designed to make visitors feel insignificant, to crush their spirits before they even reached the door. It was working. The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel of the Woofyong sweeping drive. The sound was loud in the profound silence, a lonely, singular announcement of her arrival. All the careful preparation, all the rehearsed confidence, all the quiet anger that had fueled her through the long night seemed to drain away, replaced by a single primal feeling of being utterly out of her depth. As her carriage pulled up to the massive, arched front door of the imposing, Gothic facade of Blackwood Manor, a wave of intimidating cold washed over her. It had nothing to do with the drizzling rain or the chill in the air. It was the cold of history, of unyielding power, of a world that had no place for her, and she had to get out of the carriage and walk into it alone. The carriage rocked to a halt, the gentle sway replaced by an unnerving stillness. For a moment, Eleanor did not move, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. Outside the window, the gravel drive swept toward a set of wide stone steps leading to two massive oak doors. Blackwood Manor was not a home. It was a declaration carved from gray stone in defiance against the sky. It seemed to absorb the light, leaving the surrounding Kent landscape looking pale and insignificant. A wave of cold, more profound than the autumn air, washed over her, a premonition that felt like ice in her veins. The carriage door was opened by a footman who moved with the silent efficiency of a shadow. He avoided her eyes, his attention fixed on some point in the middle distance. Eleanor stepped out, her practical leather shoes making a soft crunching sound on the perfectly raked gravel. The sound felt impossibly loud in the disquieting silence of the estate. There were no birds, no rustle of leaves in the wind, only the immense, brooding presence of the house. She took a steadying breath, the air tasting of damp earth and approaching rain. Her gaze traveled up the imposing Gothic facade, past rows of dark, unblinking windows, to the jagged crenellations that clawed at the overcast sky. It was a fortress, and she was walking willingly into its keep. A butler, tall and gaunt, with a face as impassive as the stone walls around him, met her at the top of the steps. He was already holding the door open, a sliver of a vast dark hall visible behind him. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a dry rustle of paper. It was not a question. He inclined his head a fraction of an inch, a gesture that was less a welcome and more an instruction to enter. Eleanor clutched the handle of her leather briefcase, the worn material a familiar comfort against her cold fingers. Inside, she could feel the faint outline of her father's fountain pen, a small, hard piece of courage. She stepped across the threshold, and the great doors closed behind her with a deep, resonant boom that echoed through the hall. The sound seemed to sever her connection to the outside world. The air inside was cool and still, carrying the scent of wood smoke, old beeswax, and something else, something metallic and faint, like the smell of rain on armor. The entrance hall was cavernous, the ceiling lost in shadows far above. Her footsteps, which had been soft on the gravel, now clicked sharply against a floor of polished black and white marble. On either side, the walls were lined with portraits of the Duke's ancestors. Stern-faced men and women in dark, severe clothing stared down at her, their painted eyes following her progress with silent, uniform disapproval. She felt like an intruder, a specimen being examined. The butler led her forward without a word. They passed through an archway into a long gallery, its walls lined with yet more portraits and glass cases filled with artifacts she could not discern in the dim light. The only sounds were the echo of their footsteps and the distant, sonorous ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere deep within the house. Each tick seemed to measure out the seconds of her mounting anxiety. She kept her back straight, her chin held high, forcing her gaze forward. She would not let the ghosts of his family intimidate her before the man himself had the chance. She rehearsed her opening lines in her head, the carefully constructed arguments she had spent all night perfecting. They felt flimsy and academic in this place of overwhelming, inherited power. Finally, the butler stopped before a set of double doors carved from dark, heavy wood. He placed a skeletal hand on one of the brass knobs, paused for a fraction of a second, and then pushed it open. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. "The Duke will see you now," he announced to the empty space within. Eleanor walked into the study, and the doors were closed quietly behind her. For a moment, she was alone in the silence. The room was even larger and more intimidating than the hall. It was a library, a command center, a sanctuary of masculine authority. Floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with leather-bound books lined 3 of the 4 walls. A fire crackled softly in a fireplace large enough to stand in, its flames casting dancing shadows across the room. In the center of it all stood a desk of gargantuan proportions, a slab of dark, polished oak that looked more like an altar than a piece of furniture. It was completely clear, save for a single silver letter opener placed at a precise right angle to its edge. But her attention was drawn to the far wall, which was almost entirely made of glass. A colossal bay window looked out onto a bleak, windswept moor that stretched to a bruised horizon. A figure stood before it, his back to her. Even from this distance, the sheer presence of the man was undeniable. He was tall, with broad shoulders that were perfectly defined by an impeccably tailored dark gray suit. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, utterly still, as if he were a part of the landscape he surveyed. This was him, Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood. Eleanor waited. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The clock from the hall was audible here, its steady ticking a slow, deliberate torture. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She tightened her grip on her briefcase. She would not speak first. She would not fidget. She would stand here until dawn if she had to, a statue of professional poise. The man was testing her, she knew. He was letting the sheer weight of his environment press down on her, hoping she would crumble. She thought of her father lying pale and still in his bed, his brilliant mind trapped in a failing body. The image was a shard of glass in her heart, but it was also a whetstone, sharpening her resolve. Finally, as if he had decided she had been kept waiting long enough, he turned. He moved slowly with an unhurried grace that spoke of centuries of command. His face was exactly as the society pages described, yet infinitely more severe in person. It was a composition of sharp angles and aristocratic lines, handsome but devoid of any warmth. His dark hair was cut short, his jaw firm. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a startling, piercing blue, the color of a winter sky night, and they were cold, so incredibly cold. His gaze swept over her, a slow, deliberate appraisal that began at her sensible shoes, traveled up the simple, well-made lines of her dark wool suit, lingered for a fraction of a second on the severe chignon at the nape of her neck, and finally met her eyes. There was no flicker of welcome, no hint of curiosity. There was only a profound, unconcealed dismissal. It was the look one might give a piece of furniture that had been delivered to the wrong address. He had judged her, found her wanting, and dismissed her from his thoughts, all in the space of 3 seconds. Eleanor felt a hot flush of anger and humiliation creep up her neck. All her preparation, all her years of study, all the sacrifices she had made, and she was reduced to nothing by a single arrogant glance. She forced her expression to remain neutral, a mask of calm professionalism she had spent years perfecting. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. He took a step away from the window, his movements fluid and economical. He did not walk toward her. Instead, he moved toward the massive desk, creating an even greater distance between them. He rested one hand on its polished surface, his fingers spread wide, claiming his territory. The firelight glinted off the heavy gold signet ring on his finger. When he finally spoke, his voice was just as she had imagined. It was deep and clipped, each word precise and laced with an effortless authority that expected no argument. There was no preamble, no greeting, no perfunctory inquiry about her journey. "I trust your father has sent all the relevant documents with you, Miss Vance," he said, his tone flat and bored. He did not look at her as he spoke, his gaze fixed instead on the silver letter opener on his desk. "You may leave them with my secretary. He will show you out." The words hung in the air, each one a small, sharp icicle. It was worse than she could have possibly imagined. He was not just skeptical of her ability, he was refusing to even acknowledge it. He had summoned her all the way from London, not for a meeting, not for a consultation, but to act as a courier, a messenger girl. In his eyes, she was not the head of Vance and Company. She was merely an extension of her father, an errand runner sent to deliver paperwork before being summarily dismissed. For a heartbeat, the air left Eleanor's lungs. The insult was so profound, so complete, that it almost bypassed anger and went straight to a place of hollow shock. This was the moment. This was the precipice she had been dreading. She could turn, hand the files to the phantom secretary, and walk away. She could retreat to London, her tail between her legs, and inform the senior partners that they had lost their most important client. The thought of their pitying, knowing looks was almost as galling as the Duke's own contempt. Or she could fight. Her mind flashed again to her father's face. She saw the flicker of pride in his tired eyes when she told him she would handle the Blackwood account. She felt the weak but determined squeeze of his hand on hers. He had not raised her to be a courier. He had trained her to be his successor. He had poured all his knowledge, all his passion for the law into her. To walk away now would be to betray not only herself, but him. It would be an admission that he was wrong, that his faith in her was misplaced. No, she would not. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface now cooled, hardening into something solid and unyielding in the center of her chest. It was not a hot, reckless fury, but a cold, clear resolve. The Duke of Blackwood had mistaken her for a timid schoolgirl. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. Her silence had stretched for a few seconds too long. She saw a flicker of impatience in the corner of his mouth, the slightest tightening of his jaw. He expected her to stammer an apology, to scurry away. Instead, Eleanor moved. She walked forward, her steps measured and deliberate on the plush Persian rug that covered the floor in front of the desk. She ignored the two smaller, supplicant chairs placed at a respectful distance. She walked directly to the massive conference table that sat adjacent to the Duke's desk, a long, imposing piece of furniture meant for strategy meetings and the signing of treaties. It was his war room. She reached it and without a word pulled out one of the heavy, high-backed leather chairs. The legs made a faint, defiant scraping sound against the polished wood floor. The noise was an intrusion, a deliberate disruption of the oppressive silence he had so carefully cultivated. Then with perfect composure, she sat down. She placed her briefcase on the gleaming surface of the table in front of her, the sound of the leather on the wood a soft but definitive thud. She undid the brass clasps, the metallic clicks sharp and clear in the quiet room. She did not look at him. Her focus was entirely on her task. Eleanor's jaw tightened, but her voice, when she was finally ready to speak, remained perfectly calm. She looked up from her briefcase, her gray eyes meeting his piercing blue ones across the vast expanse of the room. He was no longer looking at his letter opener. He was staring at her, his expression a mask of frozen disbelief. A hairline crack had appeared in his cold composure. For the first time since she had entered the room, she had done something he had not anticipated. She had taken a seat, uninvited, at his table. The polished mahogany of the conference table was cool beneath Eleanor's fingertips. She had taken her seat, an act of quiet defiance that hung in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam, visible and yet unacknowledged. The Duke of Blackwood, Alistair Beaumont, stood for a long moment, his back still partially turned. The silence in the cavernous study was not empty. It was a living thing, heavy with the weight of centuries of unspoken rules, all of which Eleanor had just broken. She could feel the gaze of the ancestral portraits on the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow her with the same cold judgment as their living descendant. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a second of her professional life hanging in the balance. She kept her posture ramrod straight, a technique her father had taught her. He used to say, "Your spine is your argument before you ever open your mouth." Her own argument right now felt fragile, a thread about to snap. Inside her leather briefcase, her fingers found the familiar shape of her father's fountain pen. Its smooth, worn surface was a comfort, a tangible link to the man who believed in her without question. She drew a slow, steadying breath, the air tasting of old paper, beeswax, and the faint, clean scent of rain from the moors outside. With a deliberate, almost theatrical slowness, Alistair turned fully and resumed his seat at the head of the table. He did not look at her. His movements were precise, economical, and radiated an authority that needed no reinforcement. He was the center of gravity in the room, and he knew it. Eleanor felt her junior colleague, a young and earnest solicitor named Arthur Davies, shift nervously beside her. Poor Arthur. He was a good man, diligent and capable, but he was utterly out of his depth here. He had looked at her with a kind of terrified sympathy when she had insisted on leading this meeting. Now he seemed to be trying to shrink into his own suit. Alistair arranged a single sheet of paper before him, though he never glanced at it. His piercing blue eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept past Eleanor as if she were a piece of furniture. They landed squarely on Arthur. The slight, almost imperceptible tilt of the Duke's head was a masterclass in dismissal. It communicated more effectively than any verbal insult that Eleanor was not the person to whom he wished to speak. "Mr. Davies," Alistair began, his voice a low, clipped baritone that cut through the silence. It was a voice accustomed to instant obedience. "Let us not waste time. My family has retained the services of Vance and Company for over a century because your firm has always been defined by its clarity and efficiency. I expect that tradition to continue." He paused, letting the implicit threat settle. Eleanor felt Arthur flinch beside her. "The matter of the Tidwell claim on the North Pasture," the Duke continued, his gaze unwavering from the young man's face. "It is, I am told, the primary point of contention. Give me your assessment of our position." "Directly." The insult was so clean, so perfectly executed, it was almost admirable. He had not only ignored her, but he had also framed the entire legal challenge around a point he already understood, reducing the meeting to a test of a junior's competence. He was making it clear that he was in charge, that he set the agenda, and that he would choose who was worthy of his attention. Eleanor's heart began a hard, painful drumming against her ribs. This was it. The moment she had rehearsed in her mind 100 times on the carriage ride here. She could let it pass. She could allow Arthur to answer, preserve a fragile peace, and try to steer the conversation back later. It would be the safe, expected, and feminine thing to do. She could be the quiet assistant, the note-taker, the woman who knew her place. The thought was like swallowing ash. Her father's face, pale and thin against his pillows, swam in her vision. His hand, so weak, squeezing hers. The legacy of a lifetime of work, of integrity and brilliance, was not a toy for an arrogant duke to break. Arthur cleared his throat, a small nervous sound. He was pale, his eyes wide as he stared at the formidable figure at the head of the table. "Well, Your Grace," he stammered, his hands fidgeting with a pen on the notepad before him. "The Tidwell claim, yes, it rests upon the correspondence from 1792, and our position is that the subsequent Enclosure Act of 1821 supersedes any such informal—" He was reciting from the preparatory notes. He was doing exactly as he was told, trying his best to be the efficient, clear voice the Duke demanded. But he was answering the wrong question. He was playing a game whose rules had been designed for him to lose. Eleanor felt a strange calm descend over her. The frantic drumming in her chest slowed to a steady, powerful beat. The fear did not vanish, but it crystallized into something else. Resolve. She did not look at Arthur, nor did she raise her hand. She simply spoke. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was as clear and sharp as cut glass. It sliced through Arthur's hesitant explanation and seemed to absorb all the sound in the room. "The primary challenge is not the Tidwell claim, Your Grace." Arthur stopped mid-syllable, his mouth hanging open. The Duke's head, which had been inclined toward Arthur in a pantomime of attention, did not move. For a second, nothing happened. The clock in the hall ticked. Then, as if pulled by an invisible string, Alistair's gaze shifted. It moved from Arthur and settled on her. For the first time since she had entered the room, he was truly looking at her. The lazy dismissal was gone, replaced by a flicker of irritation, of annoyance at the interruption. Eleanor held his eye gaze. She did not waver. She felt the full force of his personality, the cold, commanding pressure he exerted on everyone around him. But she also felt the solid weight of her father's pen in her hand hidden within her briefcase. She felt the weight of the hundreds of hours she had spent in the law library, the nights she had given up, the sacrifices she had made. They were her armor. She continued, her tone even and measured, as if she were explaining a simple point of fact. "The challenge is the riparian rights established in the 1888 repeal of the Local Government Act. Rights which your previous council, and indeed the Tidwell's own solicitors, have completely overlooked." Silence. A profound, shocking silence fell over the room. It was heavier than before, thick with astonishment. Arthur Davies looked as if he had been turned to stone. He stared at Eleanor, his expression a mixture of terror and awe. Eleanor pressed her advantage, her voice remaining perfectly calm. "The repeal fundamentally altered the definition of waterway access and boundary demarcation for all properties adjoining the river Stour. It makes the Tidwell correspondence from 1792, and even the Enclosure Act, entirely irrelevant." She let the statement hang in the air. She had not simply corrected him. She had dismantled the entire foundation of the meeting he had so carefully constructed. She had revealed a flaw not just in the opposing side's argument, but in his own team's prior work. It was a move of breathtaking audacity. Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, a man who had commanded lords and politicians with a single glance, froze. His entire body went still. His handsome face, usually a mask of cold, aristocratic indifference, became a canvas of raw, undisguised shock. His piercing blue eyes, which had held such casual contempt, were now wide, locked on her face. A muscle in his jaw twitched. His lips, which had been set in a firm, condescending line, parted slightly. He looked for a fleeting, impossible moment, like a man who had been struck. He did not speak. He could not speak. The carefully constructed world where he was the smartest person in any room, where women were decorative and subordinates were predictable, had just been shattered by a single calm sentence. He was staring at her as if seeing a ghost, or perhaps, for the very first time, he was seeing the woman who sat before him. He saw the intelligence burning in her gray eyes, the unyielding line of her jaw, the quiet, unshakable confidence that was not born of title or inheritance, but of pure, formidable competence. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder, marking the time of his unraveling. Eleanor could see the thoughts warring behind his eyes. First, disbelief. Then, a flash of anger at being so thoroughly wrong-footed. And finally, something else. Something she could not name. It was a dawning, grudging, and utterly startling flicker of respect. He was processing the enormity of what she had said. He was reevaluating not just the case, but everything he had assumed about her firm, about the world. Eleanor did not look away. She had thrown her gauntlet down, and now she would wait for him to either pick it up or retreat. Her heart was a wild bird in her chest, but her hands were steady on the table. She had done it. In the oppressive grandeur of his ancestral home, under the weight of his suffocating disapproval, she had taken control. She had spoken her truth, her father's truth, and the entire room had tilted on its axis. The Duke's gaze remained fixed on her, his expression a ruin of its former composure. The silence was his concession speech. Every tick of the clock was another nail in the coffin of his arrogance. He had intended to humiliate her, to put her in her place. Instead, she had shown him his. He finally drew a breath, a quiet, sharp intake of air that was a sound of defeat. But still no words came. The Duke, for the first time in his life, was rendered utterly speechless. His cold composure was not just cracked, it was completely fractured. And in the wreckage, he could do nothing but stare at the woman who had broken it. The silence in the Duke of Blackwood's study was no longer simply an absence of sound. It had become a presence, a physical weight pressing down on the room's occupants. It was in the way Eleanor's young colleague, Mr. Harris, sat frozen, his mouth still slightly parted from a gasp he had failed to contain. It was in the rigid stillness of the Duke himself, standing by the window as if he had been carved from the same gray stone as the manor. The cold mask of aristocratic indifference had been shattered, and for a breathtaking moment, the man beneath was laid bare. Shock, raw and undiluted, was etched into the lines of his face. Eleanor kept her hands resting on the polished mahogany of the conference table. Her fingers were cold, but her palms were damp. She focused on the grain of the wood, the dark swirls and lighter rivers running through it, a map of a life much older than her own. Inside her chest, her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, a wild rhythm that threatened to betray the calm she projected. She could feel the stares of the other men in the room, the Duke's secretary and Mr. Harris, but she refused to look at them. Her entire universe had narrowed to the tall, imposing figure whose world she had just tilted on its axis. He had expected a mouse, and a lioness had roared. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Alistair turned his head. His piercing blue eyes, which had earlier swept over her with such casual disdain, now fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. He was not looking at her dress, or her hair, or the simple fact that she was a woman. He was looking at her, at the mind behind her eyes. The silence stretched, becoming thinner, more brittle. Eleanor held her breath, waiting for the explosion. For the fury, the dismissal, the order to leave his home at once. Instead, he moved. Each step was deliberate, measured, as he walked from the window back to the head of the table. The floorboards did not creak beneath his weight. The house itself seemed to hold its breath with her. He did not reclaim his seat immediately. He stood behind his large, throne-like chair, his hands resting on its carved back, his knuckles white. He was looking down at her, but the angle of dominance had changed. It was no longer effortless. It was asserted, a conscious reclaiming of authority she had momentarily stolen. His gaze never left her face. He was searching for something. A flicker of triumph, a hint of fear, a sign of female hysterics. Eleanor gave him nothing. She met his stare with a placid, unwavering calm she had practiced for years in front of smirking, opposing counsels and doubtful judges. She was her father's daughter. She would not flinch. Finally, Alistair sat down. The action was slow, heavy with meaning. It was a concession, a king returning to his throne to properly hear a petition from a foreign power he had underestimated. He leaned forward slightly, the vast expanse of the oak desk between them no longer feeling like a barrier, but like a battlefield that had just been defined. He said nothing. He simply lifted his right hand, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, a flick of his long fingers. Continue. The silent command was clearer than any words he could have spoken. A wave of adrenaline, hard and sharp, washed through Eleanor. This was the moment. The opening she had created with a single sentence now had to be widened into a victory. She reached into her briefcase, her movements fluid and economical. She ignored the neatly bundled files tied with ribbon. She did not need them. Her fingers closed around the cool, smooth surface of her father's fountain pen. She did not take it out, but just touching it was enough. It was an anchor in the storm of her own anxiety. She drew strength from its familiar weight, from the memory of his hand guiding hers as she learned to write her own name. Then she pulled out a single large sheet of paper, a surveyor's map of the Blackwood estate and the surrounding lands, and unfolded it across the table. The crisp sound of the paper echoed in the quiet room. She stood up, her chair sliding back silently on the thick rug. She was now on her feet, commanding the space between them. "The Tidwell claim is a distraction, Your Grace," she began, her voice perfectly even, betraying none of the tremor she felt in her soul. "It is designed to be. Their lawyers are leading you on a costly and time-consuming chase through land registry archives from the last century. They want you to fight over the ownership of a few meaningless acres." She placed her finger on the map, on a thin blue line that snaked its way across the parchment. "But the real issue is not the land. It is the water, the Linwood stream. Your previous counsel, and it seems the Tidwells as well, have based their entire arguments on the Land Enclosure Act of 1834. It is the obvious place to look." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Obvious and therefore wrong. But they overlooked the Agricultural Holdings Repeal of 1888, a seemingly minor piece of legislation intended to clarify tenant farming rights. She looked up from the map and directly at Alistair. "But buried in Section 4, Subclause C, is a redefinition of riparian rights for inherited ducal lands. It states that any waterway originating on the estate, regardless of its path, remains under the absolute control of the title holder. The water rights were separated from the land rights." She could see the flicker in his eyes. He was following her. His mind was as sharp as she had suspected, merely clouded by arrogance. "The Tidwell family's claim rests on a deed granted to their ancestors in 1840, a deed for the land. But the 1888 repeal retroactively superseded that deed where water was concerned. They may have a piece of paper saying they own the field, but your family has a stronger, more recent parliamentary act stating you own the stream that flows through it. And without access to that water, their land is worthless for grazing. Their entire claim becomes moot." She drew a breath. The words had come easily, a torrent of information she had spent countless nights committing to memory. She felt the ghost of her father's voice in her ear, quizzing her, challenging her, pushing her. "Don't just know the law, Eleanor. Understand its shape, its history. I reviewed the precedent set in Abernathy versus the Crown from 1792, she continued, the name of the case falling from her lips with casual authority. It established that continuous, unchallenged use of a resource can create a right. The Tidwells will argue this. They will say they have used the stream for nearly 100 years, and they would be correct. Alistair's expression tightened. He thought he had found the flaw in her argument. She saw it in the slight lift of his chin. However, Eleanor said, pressing her advantage, the precedent was amended by the ruling in Davies and Sons versus the Duchy of Cornwall in 1901. That ruling specified that unchallenged use does not apply when the primary owner, in this case your family, was not legally required to challenge it. The 1888 Act was so clear, your great-grandfather had no reason to dispute their use of the water. His lack of action was not a concession of his rights. It was an expression of them. He was allowing them to use what was his. She let the silence sit for a moment, letting the full weight of her logic settle in the room. Mr. Harris was now staring at her with something akin to awe. The Duke's secretary was scribbling furiously in his notepad, trying to keep up. But Eleanor's focus remained solely on Alistair. His face was a fascinating study. The initial shock had been replaced by a deep, intense concentration. He was no longer a duke humoring a tradesman's daughter. He was a commander listening to his strategist outline a daring plan of attack. "So, my recommendation is this," she said, her voice dropping slightly, becoming more conspiratorial, more compelling. "We do not defend against the Tidwell claim. We do not engage with their lawyers on the issue of the land deed at all. We let them waste their time and money building a case that is fundamentally irrelevant." She leaned forward, her hands flat on the map. "Instead, we file our own injunction. We will petition the court to affirm your absolute riparian rights under the 1888 Act. We take the offensive. We will demand that Tidwell cease and desist all use of the Linwood stream immediately. We don't defend the castle walls, Your Grace. We ride out and lay siege to their camp." She finished. The strategy, aggressive and elegant, lay bare on the table between them. She had not only dismantled their case, she had provided the weapon to destroy it completely. She slowly straightened up and returned to her chair. Her part played. She clasped her hands in her lap to still their trembling. The adrenaline was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a vast, shaky exhaustion. All she could hear now was the loud, frantic beating of her own heart and the steady, maddening tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the corner. 1 second, 2, 3. Alistair did not speak. He stared at the map on the table, his expression completely unreadable. His face had become a smooth, blank mask again, but it was a different kind of mask. Not one of boredom, but of intense, guarded thought. He picked up a heavy silver letter opener from his desk, turning it over and over in his long fingers. The metal caught the gray light from the window, flashing in small, sharp bursts. He was thinking. He was processing. He was reevaluating everything he thought he knew about the case, about her father's firm, and about her. Eleanor felt a strange, detached pity for him. His pride was a fortress, and she had just breached its walls without firing a single cannon. He had to find a way to retreat without looking like he was fleeing. The clock ticked on. An entire minute passed. Mr. Harris shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Eleanor remained perfectly still, a statue of professional composure. She would not rush him. She would give him the dignity of his silence. Finally, he set the letter opener down with a soft, definitive click. He looked up, and his blue eyes met hers across the desk. They were cold, yes, but it was the coldness of a winter sky, clear and sharp, not the murky ice of contempt she had seen before. "I will," he began, his voice low and raspy. He stopped, cleared his throat, and started again, the words coming out clipped and precise. "I will consider your strategy." The small pause between the words was a chasm, filled with everything he could not bring himself to say. Acknowledgement, surprise, even a grudging respect. It was the most profound victory Eleanor had ever won. He stood up, the gesture a clear dismissal. "You will hear from me." It was not a threat, nor was it a promise. It was a statement of fact from a man reasserting his position of power. He would be the one to decide. He would be the one to make contact. The hierarchy, while shaken, was to be restored. "Of course, Your Grace," Eleanor replied, her voice smooth as a silk. She gave a small, crisp nod. She began to gather her things with the same unhurried precision she had displayed throughout the meeting. She folded the map along its worn creases, the paper whispering its consent. She placed it carefully into her briefcase, next to the comforting weight of her father's pen. She snapped the brass lock shut, the sound echoing in the cavernous room. Mr. Harris scrambled to his feet, fumbling with his own papers, his face flushed. Eleanor stood gracefully, smoothed the front of her jacket, and turned toward the door without a final glance at the Duke. She had said all she needed to say. To look at him now would be to seek approval, and she would not give him that satisfaction. She walked across the vast expanse of the Persian rug, her heels making no sound. The heavy oak door seemed a mile away. With every step she felt it, a strange prickling sensation on the back of her neck, a focused energy directed right at her. It was his gaze. It was no longer the dismissive, sweeping glance of a man looking past a piece of furniture. It was not the angry glare of a nobleman who had been contradicted. This was something new. It was sharp, analytical, and intensely curious. It was the look of a chess master who had just discovered his opponent was not a novice, but a grandmaster in disguise. It was the look of a predator that had just encountered a creature it did not recognize and could not immediately classify. The gaze followed her all the way to the door, a palpable force against her back. As the butler opened the door for her, she stepped into the cool, dim hallway. The door swung shut behind her with a heavy final thud, cutting off the stair. Eleanor leaned against the cold wall for a fraction of a second, closing her eyes and letting out a single, shaky breath she hadn't realized she had been holding for the better part of an hour. The silence of the hallway was a blessing, but even here, separated by thick oak and 100 feet of stone, she could still feel the lingering heat of that sharp, appraising gaze. The carriage ride back to London was a blur of muted colors and muffled sounds. Eleanor saw the passing countryside not as fields and trees, but as indistinct shapes rushing by. She felt disconnected from it all, as if she were observing the world through a thick pane of glass. The Duke's intense, searching gaze seemed to have burned itself onto her skin. She could still feel it on her back, a tangible pressure that was neither warm nor cold, but simply heavy. It was a look that promised scrutiny, a silent vow that this was not over. It was only a beginning. She paid the driver without truly seeing him, her movements automatic. She walked through the main doors of Vance and Company, nodding stiffly at the junior clerks who watched her with a mixture of awe and trepidation. The news of her summons to Blackwood Manor had rippled through the firm like a tremor, a sign of impending doom. They saw her return but could not read the outcome on her face. Her expression was a carefully constructed mask of neutrality, a habit so deeply ingrained it had become second nature. Only when she reached the sanctuary of her own office did the lock click shut behind her, and the facade finally began to splinter. She did not move to her desk. Instead, she leaned her back against the solid oak of the door, the cool, polished wood, a stark contrast to the heat rising in her skin. Her heart, which had beaten a steady, controlled rhythm throughout the entire ordeal, began to hammer against her ribs. It was a wild, frantic drumming, a delayed response to a battle she had not even been sure she was winning until the very end. A tremor started in her hands. She looked down at them, fascinated by their betrayal. They were shaking, not violently, but with a fine, persistent vibration that made her fingers feel numb. She had held them so still on the table in Alistair's study, clasped loosely together to project an air of unshakable calm. Now they seemed to belong to someone else. She pressed her palms flat against the door, trying to absorb its steadiness, to force the trembling to cease. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. She closed her eyes, and the image of his face swam into focus behind her lids. Not the cold, dismissive Duke who had greeted her, but the man whose composure had fractured. The slight parting of his lips, the flicker of disbelief in those piercing blue eyes, the way his knuckles had turned white where he gripped the arm of his chair. She had done that. She, Eleanor Vance, had silenced the Duke of Blackwood in his own fortress. A small, hysterical laugh threatened to bubble up from her chest, but she swallowed it down. It tasted like ash. The adrenaline that had sharpened her mind and steadied her voice began to recede. It left behind a profound, hollow exhaustion that settled deep in her bones. The victory felt distant, an abstract concept. In its place was a crushing wave of loneliness, so potent it made the spacious office feel like a vacuum. The silence was absolute, broken only by the steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the corner, a sound that had always brought her comfort. Today, each tick was a painful reminder of the passing seconds, each one spent utterly alone. This was the moment she had dreamed of and dreaded, a moment of triumph she could not share. Her gaze drifted across the room, past the shelves lined with her father's books, their leather spines a comforting mosaic of deep reds and browns. She saw his favorite armchair sitting empty by the unlit fireplace. How many times had she sat on the stool at his feet in this very room, recounting a small victory from court, her words tumbling out in her excitement. She could almost see him, leaning back with a quiet smile, his kind gray eyes, so like her own, twinkling with pride. He would have listened to every detail, his sharp mind dissecting her strategy, offering praise and gentle critique in equal measure. He would have understood the sheer audacity of her opening statement. He would have appreciated the nuanced dance of power, the way she had seized control without ever raising her voice. He would have seen the fear beneath her calm and he would have been proud, so fiercely proud. The thought was a sharp, physical pain in her chest. She wanted to run to his bedside, to grab his frail hand and tell him everything. She wanted to see his eyes light up, to hear his weak, raspy voice whisper her name. But she could not. He would not understand. His world had shrunk to the four walls of his bedroom, his brilliant mind clouded by illness and pain. To burden him with the complexities of the Blackwood case would be a cruelty. Her victory had to remain hers alone, a secret held tight in the silent, lonely corners of her heart. She pushed herself away from the door, her legs feeling unsteady. She walked over to her desk, the polished mahogany surface reflecting the dim afternoon light. Her briefcase sat where she had left it that morning, a lifetime ago. With methodical slowness, she unfastened the brass clasps. Her fingers brushed past the neatly organized files, the product of a sleepless night of frantic preparation. She ignored them. Her search was for something else entirely. There it was, nestled in its own velvet-lined compartment, her father's fountain pen. It was heavy in her palm, its black lacquered surface worn smooth from decades of use. The gold nib, which had signed contracts that built fortunes and drafted arguments that changed lives, was still immaculate. She ran her thumb over the cool metal, feeling the faint inscriptions, the subtle heft of it. This pen was more than just a writing instrument. It was a legacy. It was his confidence in her, made tangible. It was the weight of his hand, the echo of his voice, the silent, unwavering belief that she was capable of anything. She clutched it tightly, the edges of the clip pressing into her palm. The shaking in her hands finally subsided, replaced by the solid, reassuring presence of the pen. She brought it closer, staring at it as if it held all the answers. The silence of the room pressed in on her, vast and empty. It needed a voice. It needed a word. She lifted her head and looked at the empty armchair across the room. A whisper escaped her lips, so quiet it was almost stolen by the air. "I did it." The two words hung in the stillness, fragile and small. They were not a shout of triumph. They were a confession, a prayer, a lament. "I did it, Father. I faced the monster in his lair. I did not falter. I did not fail you." "Are you proud?" Saying it aloud did not bring the release she had hoped for. Instead, it broke the final thread of her control, the immense pressure of the day, of the weeks since her father's collapse, of a lifetime spent striving in a world that did not want her, came crashing down. The strength that had held her ramrod straight in the Duke's study dissolved, leaving her feeling brittle and exposed. She sank into her chair, the worn leather sighing under her weight. The pen was still clutched in her hand, a cold, hard anchor in a sea of overwhelming emotion. She placed it carefully on the desk, lining it up perfectly with the edge of her blotter. The meticulous, orderly gesture was a desperate attempt to impose control on the chaos raging within her. But it was no use. Her vision blurred. The sharp lines of the books on the shelves softened into a watercolor wash. The ticking of the clock grew louder, a relentless metronome counting out her heartbeats. She could still feel Alistair's gaze on her, but it was different now in her memory. It was no longer just curious. It was analytical. He was a man who calculated, who assessed. He was not admiring her. He was reevaluating an asset, recalibrating a strategy. She had not won a friend or an admirer. She had simply proven herself a more useful tool than he had initially thought. The thought was colder and sharper than any of his condescending words. It sliced through the fragile pride of her victory and laid bare the truth of her position. She was still an outsider, a woman in a man's world, her worth measured only by her utility. She finally let go. Bowing her head, she covered her face with her hands. The starched collar of her blouse felt tight and suffocating. The carefully pinned chignon felt like a cage around her head. For a long, silent moment, she just stayed there, breathing in the scent of old paper and beeswax, the familiar smell of her life, her work, her inheritance. It brought no comfort. A single hot tear escaped the fortress of her self-control. It slipped from beneath her closed eyelid and traced a slow, burning path down her cheek. She did not move to wipe it away. She let it fall, a solitary drop of grief, exhaustion, and lonely triumph. It landed with a soft, almost inaudible pat on the cold, hard surface of her desk. The single tear on her desk had long since dried, a ghost of a moment's weakness. In the days that followed, Eleanor did not allow herself the luxury of another. Victory was not a destination. It was fuel. It was the sharp, clean burn of adrenaline that propelled her out of bed before dawn and kept her poring over legal texts long after the rest of London had gone to sleep. The Duke's grudging consideration was not an approval. It was a test, and she knew he was waiting for her to fail. She would not give him the satisfaction. Her work became her armor, her father's legacy the air she breathed. This resolve brought her here to the deep, cold basement of the National Archives. It was a place where history went to be forgotten, a catacomb of paper and ink. The air was thick with the scent of decaying parchment and the faint, sweet smell of book mold. It was a smell Eleanor had always loved, the perfume of forgotten truths. A single bare bulb cast a weak yellow circle of light overhead, illuminating the dust motes that swam lazily in the still air. She was surrounded by towering shelves of gray, nameless boxes, each one a silent witness to centuries of promises and disputes. Her fingers, protected by thin cotton gloves, traced the brittle edges of a charter map from the 14th century. The parchment was cool and dry like ancient skin. She was searching for the original Blackwood estate boundaries, a line drawn by a king's hand that could unravel the entire modern claim against the Duke. She hunched over the large, stiff document, spread carefully on a wide wooden table. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of her own breathing and the faint scratch of her pencil as she made notes. This was her element. In this quiet, focused world, there were no condescending aristocrats, only facts. There were no societal expectations, only the pure, clean logic of the law. Here, she was not a woman in a man's world. She was simply a mind at work, and that was a profound relief. She adjusted the small magnifying glass, her brow furrowed in concentration, following the faded ink of a river that no longer existed. Her entire world had shrunk to this single piece of vellum, this puzzle of history and law. A soft scraping sound from the far end of the aisle broke the silence. Eleanor froze, every nerve ending suddenly on high alert. She was not supposed to be the only one down here. The archivist had assured her the section was reserved for her research today. Her hand instinctively tightened on her father's fountain pen, which lay beside her notebook, a heavy, reassuring weight. She slowly lifted her head, her eyes peering into the deep gloom beyond her little island of light. A figure was emerging from the shadows between two towering shelves, a tall, imposing silhouette that was becoming unnervingly familiar. It was him. Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, stood there holding a slender, rolled-up document. He was dressed not in the severe formality of his study, but in a simple tweed jacket and dark trousers. He looked younger, less like a monument and more like a man. His dark hair was slightly disordered, as if he had run a hand through it in frustration. For a split second, their eyes met across the dusty expanse. She saw a flicker of surprise in his, a mirror of her own. Then, the mask of cold indifference snapped back into place. His jaw tightened. Eleanor's heart gave a painful thud against her ribs. Of all the places in London, he was here, in her sanctuary. Her first instinct was to look away, to pretend she hadn't seen him, to retreat back into the safety of her work. But she had met his gaze. The moment had passed. She forced her spine to straighten, her chin to lift. She would not be the one to show discomfort. She had earned her right to be here as much as he had. "Your Grace," she said, her voice quiet but steady. It seemed to travel an immense distance in the heavy silence. He gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod. "Miss Vance, Dodgin." He did not seem pleased to see her. He looked past her, his gaze sweeping over the cluttered table as if searching for an escape. He seemed cornered, a predator finding himself unexpectedly in another's territory. He unrolled the document in his hands, a large medieval charter, and laid it on the edge of a nearby shelf, using a book as a weight. He leaned over it, his back angled slightly toward her, a clear dismissal. The message was obvious. Their business was concluded at Blackwood Manor. Here they were strangers. A part of Eleanor was relieved. She did not want another confrontation. But another part of her, the part that had felt the sting of his initial contempt, felt a familiar spark of defiance. She turned her attention back to her own map, trying to ignore his powerful presence just a few yards away. But it was impossible. The silent, dusty room now felt charged, the air thick with his unspoken disapproval. She could feel his presence like a change in atmospheric pressure. She tried to focus on the faded Latin script, but the words blurred. Her mind was filled with the image of him standing there, so completely out of place and yet so entirely self-contained. Why was he here? Surely a duke had people to conduct such tedious research for him. She risked a glance in his direction. He was leaning closer to his charter, his brow deeply furrowed. He traced a line of text with his finger, his lips moving silently. There was an intensity in his posture, a deep concentration that she recognized because she felt it so often herself. For a moment, the Duke was gone. In his place was a scholar, wrestling with a historical puzzle. He let out a quiet, frustrated sigh and straightened up, staring at the document as if it had personally offended him. Curiosity, sharp and unwelcome, pricked at Eleanor. What was he studying with such focus? Against her better judgment, her eyes strayed to the charter he was examining. Even from this distance, she could recognize the script style and the particular seal. It was from the same period, likely the same royal court, as the land grant she was investigating for his own case. Her legal mind, always cataloging and connecting, began to work. His research was not separate from hers. It was parallel. Perhaps he was double-checking her work, still convinced of her incompetence. The thought sent a hot flush of anger through her. She forced the feeling down. Anger was unproductive. Logic was her tool. She focused on the charter again, her eyes narrowing. He was tracing the edge of a waterway depicted on the vellum. She followed the line from her vantage point, her mind overlaying it with the map on her own table. And then she saw it, a small, almost invisible notation near the bend in the river on his charter. A tiny cross and a Latin annotation, written in a different hand, a later edition. It was a detail anyone could miss. But her father had trained her to see the whispers of history, the small amendments that changed everything. The annotation mentioned a change in the river's course due to a great flood in the late 13th century. A flood that was not mentioned in any of the official land registry documents she had reviewed. A flood that would have shifted the Blackwood property line significantly, placing a disputed parcel of land squarely within his ancestral rights. It was a detail relevant to his charter, but it was the key to her entire strategy. Her heart began to beat faster. She had to tell him. It was her professional duty. But the thought of approaching him, of inviting that cold, dismissive gaze again, made her hesitate. He had made it clear he wanted to be left alone. To interrupt him would be an intrusion. He might see it as another attempt to prove herself, an act of unseemly forwardness. She pictured his icy stare, the slight curl of his lip. She took a deep breath, the dusty air catching in her throat. No, she was his legal counsel. Her duty was to the case, not to his pride or her own comfort. Hiding a piece of crucial information, no matter how small, was a dereliction of that duty. Her father would never have hesitated. She picked up her pencil, her fingers strangely steady. She walked a few steps toward him, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the stone floor. He didn't look up until she was standing beside him. When he finally sensed her presence, he straightened abruptly, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. His piercing blue eyes met hers, cold and questioning. "Forgive me, Your Grace," Eleanor began, her voice even. "I do not mean to intrude on your private research." "Then do not, Miss Vance," he said, his tone clipped and final. He made a move to roll up the charter. "It is not private," she said quickly, her courage almost failing her. "I believe it pertains directly to your case, to our case." He paused, his hand still on the edge of the parchment. A skeptical eyebrow arched. "And what would make you believe that?" Instead of answering, she leaned forward slightly, pointing with the tip of her pencil to the tiny faded cross on the vellum. She was intensely aware of his proximity, of the warmth radiating from him in the cold room. She could smell the faint, clean scent of wool in winter air. "This annotation here," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, as if they were sharing a secret. "It notes the Great Flood of 1287. It says the River Tay shifted its course by nearly 200 yards to the east." Alistair leaned in, his gaze following her pencil. He squinted at the almost invisible markings. For a long moment he was silent, his focus absolute. She watched the play of emotion on his face, a rare and fascinating sight. She saw disbelief, then curiosity, then a dawning, grudging understanding. He had missed it. The official maps in the county record do not account for that shift, she continued softly. They are based on surveys from the 16th century, long after the river's original path was forgotten. But this charter, being contemporary to the event, records it. He looked from the charter to her, and for the first time, his eyes held no condescension. They held a spark of something else, a sharp, analytical light. The king's survey of 1540 would be inaccurate then, he mused, more to himself than to her. It would have been based on the river as it was, not as it had been when the original grant was made. Precisely, Eleanor said, a thrill of connection running through her. He understood. He saw the implication immediately. It makes the Tidwell claim, which is based on the 1540 survey, fundamentally flawed. The land they claim was never theirs because the border was never where they believe it was. He stared at the map, then back at her. A slow, thoughtful frown creased his brow. But the doctrine of accretion, he countered, his voice now engaged, losing its clipped formality. Would the law not grant the land added by the river's slow movement to the adjacent landowner? It would, she conceded, if the change were slow and imperceptible. The legal term is accretion, but this annotation describes a sudden, violent event, a flood. The legal principle for that is avulsion. In cases of avulsion, the property boundary does not change. It remains at its original location, regardless of where the river now flows. She was no longer just his hired solicitor. He was no longer a duke. They were two minds, sparring over a point of law and history. The dusty basement, the weak light, the towering shelves of forgotten documents all faded away. There was only the map between them and the exhilarating spark of intellectual combat. Avulsion requires proof of a sudden, identifiable event, he argued, his gaze sharp and focused on her. A single, faded annotation from a monk with a grudge against the local abbot might not be sufficient proof for a modern court. The annotation gives a date, Eleanor replied, her own excitement rising. We can cross-reference it with monastic chronicles from the period. The Abbey of St. Giles was less than 5 miles from this location. Their scribes were meticulous. If there was a catastrophic flood in 1287, they would have recorded it. Alistair fell silent, but it was not the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of deep thought. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and his expression was one of unguarded appraisal. He saw not a woman, not an upstart, but a formidable intellect. An equal, the dust motes danced in the single shaft of light between them, illuminating the space where their two worlds had unexpectedly collided. The air was electric with unspoken thoughts, with the raw, thrilling energy of two minds perfectly in sync. The Chronicles of St. Giles, he said slowly, a strange light in his eyes. They are held in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, not here. I am aware, Eleanor said simply. I was planning to travel there tomorrow. He stared at her for another long moment. The silence stretched, filled with the weight of his reassessment. She felt as though she were under a microscope, every fiber of her being analyzed and catalogued. She held his gaze, her heart pounding a steady, defiant rhythm. She had not sought his approval, but in this shared moment of discovery, she felt she might have earned something far more valuable: his respect. The cold, handsome mask had slipped, and for a fleeting instant, she saw the man beneath, a man who valued intelligence above all else. A man, she realized with a jolt, who was profoundly lonely in his intellectual world. Finally, he broke the silence. He straightened up, stepping back slightly and restoring the formal distance between them. The Duke returned, but his posture was different. The rigid stiffness was gone, replaced by a kind of settled authority. He looked from her back to the charter on the shelf, then back to her. He gave a single, curt nod. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it landed with the force of a royal decree. It was not polite, it was not gracious, it was genuine. It was a nod of acknowledgement from one scholar to another, an admission of a point well made, a battle of wits fairly won. It was more honest and more meaningful than any of the hollow pleasantries he had offered at the manor. He then turned away, without another word, rolling up his charter with precise, deliberate movements. He slid it into a leather tube, his back once again to her. The brief, intense connection was severed. The space between them grew cold again. He walked back into the gloom of the aisle and disappeared among the towering shelves, leaving Eleanor alone in the small circle of light. She stood frozen for a moment, her pencil still in her hand. The silence that descended was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the echo of their debate, with the ghost of his grudging respect. She slowly turned back to her own table, her mind racing. Her hand trembled slightly as she placed the pencil down beside her father's pen. The work ahead was still immense, the battle far from over. But something fundamental had shifted in the dusty air between her and the Duke of Blackwood. The silence of the archives was a memory, replaced by the familiar, ordered hum of Vance and Condé's had passed since the brief, intense debate among the dust motes in ancient maps. Eleanor had returned to her duties, the encounter with the Duke, a strange, unresolved chord hanging in the air. She expected nothing. She braced for a letter of dismissal, a final, curt rejection delivered to the firm, not to her. The curt nod he had given her felt more like a truce than an alliance, a temporary ceasefire in a war she was still certain she was losing. Her focus remained sharp, a defense against the hope that flickered within her. Hope was a vulnerability she could not afford. Then, on a gray Tuesday afternoon, the quiet rhythm of the office was broken. It was not the usual shuffle of a junior clerk, but the firm, decisive steps of a courier, his leather satchel making a soft thudding sound against his hip. He stopped directly in front of her desk, ignoring the senior partners who glanced up from their papers with mild curiosity. The courier held out a single, thick cream envelope, sealed with a severe black wax stamp bearing the Beaumont crest. Her heart gave a single, hard thump against her ribs. This was it. The end of the firm's most important client relationship, delivered by a stranger. She reached for it, her fingers steady despite the tremor she felt deep inside. The senior clerk, Mr. Abernathy, began to rise from his desk, assuming the correspondence was for the firm's general attention. But the courier did not release the envelope. He cleared his throat. "For Miss E. Vance," he stated, his voice loud in the quiet room. "Specifically." He placed it firmly in her hand, his eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second before he gave a curt nod and departed. Silence descended. Every eye in the main office was now on her. It was no longer mild curiosity. It was astonishment, suspicion, and in the case of a few older partners, outright disapproval. Eleanor felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a blush of both pride and intense pressure. She turned the envelope over. The handwriting was sharp, angular, and aggressively neat. Miss E. Vance, Vance and Kibbles Solicitors, London. The E was a deliberate, pointed initial. He had not only acknowledged her existence, but he had singled her out. She retreated to the relative privacy of her own office, the heavy oak door closing with a reassuring click. Her hands, she now realized, were shaking slightly. She placed the envelope on her perfectly organized desk, where it looked like a foreign object, a disruption to the careful order she had built around herself. For a long moment, she just looked at it. She traced the sharp edges of the seal with her fingertip. It was still warm. She slid a letter opener beneath the wax, the crackle it made sounding like a gunshot in the silent room. The note inside was brief, almost offensively so. There was no salutation, no preamble. It was a single, dense paragraph detailing a point of contention regarding medieval water rights, a subclause of a subclause from an obscure charter dated to the 14th century. It was a question of staggering complexity, one that would require hours, if not days, of dedicated research into feudal law. It was a problem wrapped in an enigma, tied with a knot of pure intellectual arrogance. At the bottom of the page was a single stark initial. A. Eleanor read it once. Then she read it again. A slow smile touched her lips, the first genuine smile she had felt in weeks. This was not a dismissal. This was not an insult. This was a test. It was a gauntlet thrown down, not at her father's firm, but at her. Alistair was not just acknowledging her competence. He was challenging it directly, on his own terms. He was sending a message that their debate in the archives was not over. It had simply moved to a new arena. A deep, surprising warmth spread through her chitta. It was the thrill of being seen, truly seen, by a mind she was beginning to respect, even as she despised its owner's prejudice. The afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the leather-bound books that lined her walls. The offices of Vance and Company slowly emptied. The sounds of closing doors, polite goodnights, and the final scrape of chairs echoed through the building. Soon the only sound was the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the distant, muffled rumble of London settling into its evening rhythm. Eleanor, however, remained at her desk. She had sent a junior clerk for a stack of specific volumes from the firm's private library, books that had not been opened in decades. The scent of old paper and dry leather filled her small office. A single lamp cast a warm, golden circle on her desk, illuminating the Duke's stark note in the open pages of a heavy tome. She worked. All thoughts of the firm's precarious position, of her father's fragile health, of the disapproving stares of her colleagues, all of it faded away. There was only the puzzle. There was only the intricate web of law and history that Alistair had presented to her. Her mind, so often burdened with anxiety and grief, felt clean and sharp, like a fine blade honed for a single purpose. She took out her father's fountain pen. The familiar weight of it in her hand was a comfort, a tangible link to the man who had taught her to love the elegant logic of the law. She uncapped it, the faint scent of ink a welcome perfume. On a fresh sheet of foolscap, she began to write. Her notes were not just a collection of facts. They were an argument, a conversation she was having across time with jurists and scribes long dead, and across the city with the Duke of Blackwood himself. She found a precedent in a forgotten land dispute from the reign of King Edward III. She cross-referenced it with a treatise on riparian boundaries written by a Dutch scholar in the 1700s. Each piece of information was a victory. Each connection she made was a quiet thrill. This was not work. It was a form of intellectual combat, and she was enjoying it immensely. She imagined Alistair in his own vast study, surrounded by his own ancient books, perhaps anticipating her response. Would he expect her to find the flaw in his premise? Did he even know there was one, or was he testing her to see if she would discover it? Hours bled into one another. Her tea grew cold beside ear. The city outside her window became a dark, glittering expanse. She barely noticed. She had found it. A discrepancy in the charter's transcription from the original Latin, a single word change that altered the entire meaning of the clause Alistair had cited. It was a mistake so subtle, so buried in centuries of legal translation, that only someone with an obsessive attention to detail would ever find it. A surge of pure, unadulterated triumph shot through her. It was a feeling so potent it almost made her dizzy. She had not just answered his question. She had dismantled it. She leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking in the profound silence. Her response was drafted, a model of clarity and precision, respectfully pointing out the transcription error and providing the correct interpretation, complete with citations. It was flawless. It was unassailable. A deep sense of satisfaction settled over her, warm and solid. For the first time since her father's illness, she felt a flicker of her old self, the confident, brilliant student who loved the law for its own sake. She felt in that moment truly her father's daughter. Finally, she looked at the clock on her mantelpiece. It was past 10. The building was completely still. A deep exhaustion settled into her bones, but it was a good exhaustion, the kind that comes from a day of meaningful, successful labor. She carefully capped her father's pen, organized her notes, and prepared to leave. The air outside would be cold, and the walk home would be long, but her mind was alight. She stepped out of the office building and into the damp London night. A fine, persistent drizzle was falling, the kind that soaked through a coat and chilled you to the bone. The gaslights cast halos of shimmering gold on the wet cobblestones, their reflections broken by the constant patter of the rain. The streets were mostly empty, the sound of her own footsteps echoing softly against the dark facades of the buildings. Her usual route home took her through a small, elegant park, a patch of green surrounded by iron railings. It was a shortcut she rarely took at night, but tonight she felt a strange pull towards its quiet solitude. The park was dark, the trees dripping onto the gravel path. The scent of wet earth and rain-soaked leaves was heavy in the air. As she walked, her mind still replaying her legal discovery, a shape up ahead caught her eye, a solitary figure standing motionless by the wrought iron fence that overlooked a small ornamental pond. Most people would have hurried past, wary of a stranger lingering in the dark. But something about the stillness of the figure, its absolute lack of menace, made her slow her steps. He was not wearing a hat. The rain darkened his hair, plastering it to his head. His shoulders, usually so straight and imposing, were slumped. He was staring down into the dark water of the pond, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tailored overcoat. Even from a distance, in the dim, shifting light of the gas lamp, there was something familiar about his profile, about the proud set of his jaw. Her breath caught in her throat. It was him. It was Alistair. But it was not the Duke of Blackwood. The invisible mantle of authority, the cold, impenetrable armor of his title, was gone. Stripped away by the rain and the darkness, he looked like just a man, a tall, lonely man standing bareheaded in a downpour. There was a profound sadness in his posture, a sense of defeat so palpable she could feel it from across the path. The arrogant, dismissive aristocrat who had tried to humiliate her was nowhere to be seen. In his place was someone who looked lost, someone who looked burdened by a weight far heavier than a legal dispute. Eleanor froze in the shadows of a large oak tree, her heart pounding. Her first instinct was to turn and walk away, to grant him the privacy of his sorrow. But she could not move. She was transfixed by this glimpse of the man behind the mask. All the anger she had harbored towards him, all the resentment for his condescension, began to dissolve. It was replaced by a new confusing emotion. It was an ache of empathy for his solitude, for the unknown sadness that had driven him out into the cold, wet night. He did not move. He just stood there, a statue of silent grief, the rain tracing paths down his face that could have been tears. She wondered what could possibly make a man with so much power, so much privilege, look so utterly broken. Was it the pressure of his title? A personal loss? A failure she could not comprehend? The questions swirled in her mind, but she knew she would never have the answers. This was a private moment, one she had stumbled upon by accident. To intrude upon it would be a violation. Slowly, carefully, she began to back away, her shoes making no sound on the wet grass. She kept her eyes on him, on the solitary figure silhouetted against the shimmering pond. The man who was her adversary, her intellectual rival, and now, suddenly, the object of a strange and powerful sympathy. She felt like she had seen something she was not meant to see, a crack in the formidable facade that revealed a startling vulnerability beneath. He doesn't see her, and she slips away into the shadows, her heart aching with a confusing pang of sympathy. The memory of him in the rain was a persistent, unsettling ghost. It followed Eleanor through her days at the office, a quiet shadow that fell across case files and legal precedents. She had seen the Duke of Blackwood stripped of his title, his power, his impenetrable armor. She had seen a man looking lost in a world that was supposed to belong to him. The image was a complication she did not need, a confusing ache of sympathy for her adversary. It made the fight harder, because the enemy now had a human face, a sad one. Several days later, a note arrived. It was delivered by a Blackwood footman, the envelope thick and creamy, the ducal crest embossed in black wax. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal. The message inside was brief, the handwriting sharp and decisive. It requested a meeting to discuss the next phase of the strategy, but it was the final line that made her sit back in her chair, her breath catching in her throat. He proposed the meeting take place at her office, Advance and Company. This was not a summons, it was a request, and it was a concession of monumental scale. A duke did not travel to his solicitor was brought to him. It was a shift in the very foundations of their dynamic, a quiet acknowledgement that the ground beneath their feet had changed. He was coming to her territory, to the heart of her father's legacy, the room where she now sat in her father's chair. A wave of nervous energy, sharp and electric, coursed through her. This was not just another meeting. It was a test of a different kind. On the morning of the meeting, Eleanor found that she could not sit still. She arranged and rearranged the files on her desk, though they were already in perfect order. She straightened the portrait of her grandfather that hung on the wall, his stern gaze a familiar comfort. The office, usually her sanctuary of calm control, felt charged with an unfamiliar energy. The scent of old paper and beeswax was sharper, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall louder, each tick a countdown. She wore a simple, dark gray dress, severe in its tailoring. She needed to be unimpeachable, a figure of pure professionalism. Yet her heart hammered against her ribs with a distinctly unprofessional rhythm. She thought of her father, lying in his quiet room miles away. She wished she could tell him about this small, significant victory. She imagined his weak smile, the pride that would shine in his tired eyes. The thought gave her strength. She was not just Eleanor Vance, a young woman trying to prove her worth. She was the custodian of his life's work. She sat behind the large mahogany desk, her father's heavy fountain pen resting near her hand. She picked it up, its familiar weight grounding her. When the knock finally came, she was ready. Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, filled the doorway. He seemed even taller and more imposing in the relatively constrained space of her office than he had in the cavernous halls of his manor. He was not dressed for the country, but for the city, in a perfectly tailored dark suit that emphasized his broad shoulders. His piercing blue eyes swept the room, taking in the walls of leather-bound books, the worn spines speaking of decades of knowledge. His gaze lingered for a moment on her father's empty chair by the fireplace before finally settling on her. "Miss Vance," he said. His voice was the same clipped, formal tone she remembered, but the layer of condescension was gone. It was replaced by something else, a neutral, watchful respect. "Your Grace," she replied, her own voice steady. She rose from her chair but did not come around the desk. She would meet him from her position of authority. "Thank you for coming. Please." She gestured to the leather armchair opposite her desk. He moved with his innate, aristocratic grace and sat, the old leather creaking faintly under his weight. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the polished expanse of mahogany. The power dynamic, once so skewed, had found a new precarious equilibrium. He was still a duke, and she was still his solicitor. But they were also two people who had glimpsed something beyond those roles, in a dusty archive in a rain-slicked park. "Your strategy," he began, getting straight to the point, "was audacious. I have had my other advisors review it. They find it aggressive." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "Aggressive action is required, Your Grace. The Tidwell family is attempting to exploit a perceived weakness. A strong, decisive response is the only way to reassert the Blackwood estate's long-established rights." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the arms of the chair. He listened. He truly listened, his eyes fixed on hers, his expression intent. It was a startling change from their first meeting, where he had dismissed her before she had even spoken a word. They pointed to the potential political fallout, he continued, of challenging a family with considerable local influence. "Political influence wanes when faced with incontrovertible legal standing," Eleanor countered smoothly. "Our case is built on the 1888 repeal, a point of law that is absolute. There is built on local sentiment and a questionable historical claim. Sentiment does not hold up in court, Your Grace." He considered her words, a thoughtful silence stretching between them. She could almost see the gears turning in his mind, weighing her logic, testing it for flaws. He was not just hearing her, he was engaging with her, treating her as a true intellectual counterpart. A strange warmth spread through her chest, a feeling of profound, hard-won validation. It was more satisfying than she could have ever imagined. "There is the matter of the southern boundary," Alistair said, his tone shifting from adversarial to collaborative. "The original charter maps are notoriously imprecise. The Tidwells claim the old creek bed as the line, but our own family records suggest it is the ridgeline 200 yards further south." "I am aware of the discrepancy," Eleanor said, grateful for the long hours she had spent with those very maps. "I have the relevant survey charts here." She rose and moved to a long side table where several large rolled documents were waiting. Alistair stood as well, watching her. She selected a heavy roll of parchment and carried it back to her desk, pushing aside her neat stacks of paper to make room. She untied the ribbon, and the map unfurled with a dry rustle, its edges curling stubbornly. It requires waiting, she murmured, more to herself than to him. Alistair was already moving to the other side of the desk. He placed his hand on one end of the map, his long fingers pressing down on the faded ink. Eleanor mirrored his action on her side, and together they smoothed the ancient parchment flat. They were suddenly much closer, leaning over the wide desk, the map stretching between them like a bridge. The space felt immediately smaller, more intimate. Eleanor was acutely aware of his presence, the faint, clean scent of his cologne, mingling with the dusty aroma of the old map. She could feel a subtle warmth radiating from him across the desk. She forced her attention back to the task at hand, her professionalism a fragile shield. "The issue is here," she said, her voice a little tighter than she would have liked. She leaned forward, tracing a faint, faded line with her index finger. "The cartographer in 1752 noted a great oak as a marker. This tree is central to our claim that the ridge was the intended boundary." Alistair leaned closer as well, his dark head bent near hers. His gaze followed her finger. "The tree is long gone," he said, his voice a low murmur. "It fell in a storm during my grandfather's time. Its absence is the core of the Tidwell's argument." "Its absence is irrelevant if we can prove where it stood," Eleanor insisted, her focus narrowing. She let her finger rest on a small, almost imperceptible mark on the map. The surveyor from that era used a specific triangulation method. He would have taken bearings from at least two other permanent landmarks. If we can find those points on a modern map, the old church spire and the standing stones on the western hill. Alistair finished her sentence, his voice filled with a sudden, sharp understanding. He pointed to two other marks on the map, his own finger moving to the exact spot she had been studying. "The location can be recreated." "Precisely." As he spoke, their hands, both pointing to the same crucial detail on the yellowed parchment, brushed against each other. It was the briefest of contacts, just the side of his finger against hers. A jolt, sharp and undeniable, shot up Eleanor's arm. It was like a spark of static electricity, but 1,000 times more potent, a searing heat that made her snatch her hand back as if she had been burned. Her heart gave a violent lurch, and the air rushed from her lungs. The intricate lines of the map blurred into a meaningless swirl of brown and black. The ticking of the clock in the hall seemed to stop entirely. She saw Alistair withdraw his own hand just as quickly, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the desk. The mask of cool composure he wore so well had cracked. For a fleeting second, his piercing blue eyes showed a flicker of raw shock, of unguarded surprise before he looked away, his jaw tight. The silence that fell was no longer professional or thoughtful. It was thick, heavy, and suffocating. It was filled with the sudden, shocking awareness of what had just passed between them. A simple, accidental touch had shattered the carefully constructed walls of their professional relationship, exposing something raw and intensely personal beneath. The room, her office, her fortress of logic and control, was suddenly charged with unspoken feelings, with a tension that had nothing to do with legal strategy or disputed land rights. Eleanor stared down at the map, her gaze unfocused. She could not bring herself to look at him. She was intensely aware of him standing just a few feet away, a silent, imposing presence. She could feel the lingering warmth on her skin where he had touched her, a phantom sensation that made her fingers tingle. The air in the room became thick with unspoken feelings, and neither could meet the other's eye for a long moment. The silence after their accidental touch lingered for days. It was a tension that made their cool professionalism feel like a costume. Work continued, but the air between them was different. Eleanor found herself tracing the map where their fingers had met, her own skin tingling. She knew the Duke of Blackwood was no longer just a client. He was a man whose loneliness she had glimpsed in the rain. That fragile peace shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. A junior clerk named Arthur burst into her office without knocking, his face pale. He was holding a cream-colored envelope from the solicitors representing the Tidwell family. Wordlessly, he stumbled forward and placed it on her perfectly organized desk. Inside was a photostatic copy of a letter, dated nearly 80 years prior. Eleanor's eyes scanned the elegant script. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable, a bold scrawl she recognized from countless estate documents. It was signed by Alistair's great-grandfather. The text was devastatingly simple. It was a personal letter to the head of the Tidwell family, speaking of a gentleman's agreement. It clearly relinquished the rights to the disputed parcel of land. A cold dread pierced through Eleanor. This changed everything. Their entire case was rendered meaningless by this single piece of paper. She felt the floor drop out from beneath her. For a moment, all she could see was her father's disappointed face, the legacy he entrusted to her turning to ash. She forced herself to breathe. She dismissed the stammering clerk, her own voice calm and steady. When he had scrambled out, she let her head fall into her hands. It had to be a forgery, but the signature was perfect. The language was of the period. This was not just a setback, it was a catastrophe. The emergency meeting with the senior partners was worse than she imagined. The room was thick with the sour smell of fear. Mr. Davies, a man whose skepticism of Eleanor had been clear from the beginning, paced before the window. He spoke of irreparable damage, of the folly of an aggressive strategy. Every word was a thinly veiled accusation aimed directly at her. The other partners, men who had worked alongside her father for decades, murmured their agreement. They were ready to sacrifice the Blackwood estate, to draft a letter of apology to the Duke. Finally, Mr. Davies turned to her with an expression of performative pity. He suggested he take over communications with the Duke to smooth things over. The condescension was suffocating. Eleanor stepped forward. Her voice, when she spoke, cut through the defeated murmurs like glass. She stated that she was still the lead counsel. She reminded them the letter had not yet been authenticated. She declared she would not be writing any letters of apology. She would be demanding to inspect the original document. A stunned silence fell. Before they could argue, she turned and left the room. She walked back to her office, the sound of her heels a defiant rhythm on the polished floor. She shut the door, leaned against it, and finally allowed herself to tremble. The bravado drained away, leaving a hollow ache of terror and profound isolation. They thought she was a fool. And what if they were right? That evening, her small apartment felt like a cage. She spread the files across her dining table, the legal arguments and maps looking like relics of a battle already lost. Doubt was a bitter poison. The weight of Alastair's history, his family's honor, felt immense. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked toward midnight when the telephone rang. The shrill bell was so unexpected it made her jump. She lifted the heavy receiver, her heart hammering. She expected a late call from the office. For a long moment there was only the faint crackle of the line and the sound of a man's ragged breathing. Then a voice spoke her name. It was a voice she knew intimately, yet it was almost unrecognizable. The clipped aristocratic authority was gone. All that remained was a raw, frayed edge of sound. It was Alistair. He just said her name, Miss Vance. The way he said it was not a summons, but a plea. Eleanor's own breath caught. She gripped the receiver, her knuckles turning white. She could picture him alone in his vast, dark study, the weight of his name finally crushing him. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. I have just been informed about the letter. He paused, and she heard him swallow. They tell me it's over. Then came the words that shattered the last of his ducal armor. Miss Vance, I don't know what to do. It was the sound of a proud man admitting utter defeat. Every ounce of anger she had felt, every bit of professional rivalry, dissolved in that instant. The man on the other end of the line was not the Duke of Blackwood. He was Alistair, and he was afraid. A fierce, protective instinct, powerful and overwhelming, surged through her. The fear in his voice found its counterpart in her own sudden, unshakable resolve. Her voice was low, but it did not waver. Do not worry, Your Grace, she said. I will handle it. The click of the telephone receiver being placed back in its cradle was the only sound in the cavernous office. It was a small, definitive noise that seemed to sever the final thread of Alastair's ducal authority, leaving only the echo of his voice. It was a voice she had never heard before, stripped of its cold command and filled with a raw, human desperation that resonated deep within her chest. Eleanor, hearing the fear in his voice, felt a fierce, protective instinct surge through her. Do not worry, Your Grace, she had said. I will handle it. The words had been a promise, a shield offered against his panic. Now, in the profound silence, they became a binding contract with herself. Her gaze fell upon the neatly copied text of the rival's new evidence. lying starkly on the polished surface of her desk. A single sheet of paper that threatened to unravel a 300-year-old legacy. The senior partners had already accepted defeat, their faces grim, their shoulders slumped. They saw a losing battle. Eleanor saw a declaration of war. She stood for a long moment, the quiet hum of London at night, a distant murmur beyond the thick glass of her window. The city was going to sleep, but her work was just beginning. A strange energy, born from Alistair's vulnerability, began to burn through her veins, pushing aside the day's fatigue. This was no longer just a case, it was a rescue. She walked to the door and spoke quietly to her junior clerk, young Mr. Davies, who was hovering nervously in the outer office. She told him to go home, to get some rest. He looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and concern, as if she were a general dismissing her last soldier before a solitary stand. When he was gone, she locked the main door herself. The solid thud of the bolt sliding into place was another punctuation mark, sealing her inside this fortress of leather-bound books and quiet desperation. Alone. It was better this way. There could be no distractions, no whispers of doubt from the corridors. The first few hours were a meticulous, frustrating exercise in futility. She spread the copy of the letter out under the bright, focused glare of her desk lamp. Beside it, she placed known samples of the great-grandfather's correspondence, retrieved from the firm's extensive archives. The handwriting was the first point of attack. She studied the loops of the L's, the sharp, decisive crosses of the T's. She compared the pressure of the pen's strokes, the spacing between the words. But the forger was a master. The script was nearly identical, a perfect mimicry of the old Duke's confident hand. Every flourish, every nuance seemed authentic. It was unnervingly good. She moved on to the content. She pulled ledgers, family journals, and estate records from the Blackwood archives, piling them high on her desk until she was barricaded by towers of aging paper. She cross-referenced the dates mentioned in the letter with the great-grandfather's known movements. Could he have been at the location specified on that day? The records were ambiguous. He had been in the county, but his personal journals, usually so detailed, had a week of entries missing, the pages torn out long ago. A cold knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. It was a dead end. Everything they presented seemed plausible, carefully constructed to withstand scrutiny. Midnight came and went. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall was a slow, relentless metronome, counting down the seconds to their defeat. Eleanor pushed away from the desk, her back aching, her eyes burning from the strain. She made her way to the small kitchenette and brewed a pot of coffee, the bitter aroma filling the silent office. As she waited, she stared out the window at the rain-slicked, empty streets below. The gas lights cast long, shimmering reflections on the wet cobblestones. She remembered seeing him in the park, standing alone in the drizzle, looking utterly lost. The memory sharpened her resolve. He had trusted her. He had called her when his world was collapsing, his voice devoid of the pride that was his armor. He had given her his fear, a gift more intimate than any confession. She could not, would not fail him. Returning to her desk, she pushed aside the handwriting analysis. Her instincts screamed that it was a dead end. The answer was not in what was written, but in the very thing it was written upon. It was something her father had taught her years ago, a lesson from one of his own obscure cases. "People lie, Eleanor," he had said, his voice then strong and clear. "Signatures can be forged, but the paper itself, the ink, they have their own history. They cannot lie if you know how to listen." She picked up the copy of the letter again. The clerk had noted the quality of the original, its texture, its weight. He had described it as fine linen rag paper, consistent with the period. But was it? Something nagged at her, a tiny splinter of doubt in the back of her mind. She had handled countless documents from that era. They had a certain feel, a subtle unevenness from the hand-cranked presses in less refined pulp. The description from her clerk suggested a paper that was perhaps too perfect. Her heart began to beat a little faster. This was a new path, a fragile thread in the darkness. She needed to see more than the copied words. She needed to see the paper's soul. On the corner of her desk sat a heavy brass magnifying glass, its handle worn smooth. It was her father's, another piece of him she kept close. She picked it up, its familiar weight a comfort in her palm. She held the copy of the letter, angling it under the lamp. The transcription was impeccable, but along the margins, the clerk had made faint pencil notes about the physical document. One note stood out. Faint watermark observed. Crown over lion rampant. Difficult to discern. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. A watermark. The forger was either brilliant or incredibly foolish to use watermark paper. A watermark was a signature, a fingerprint left by the paper mill itself. It was a detail so obscure that most would overlook it, assuming it only added to the document's authenticity. Her movements became sharp, economical. The exhaustion that had been settling into her bones evaporated, replaced by the electric hum of the hunt. She left her office and went down the hall to the firm's private library, a room her father had curated over 40 years. The air was cool and smelled of old paper and beeswax. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books in the reference section, searching for one particular volume. It was a heavy, obscure text bound in dark green leather, a comprehensive history of English papermakers, 1750 to 1900. She pulled it from the shelf and carried it back to her desk as if it were a sacred text. Her hands trembled slightly as she laid the book open. The pages were filled with detailed drawings of hundreds of watermarks, cataloged by symbol, region, and mill. A crown over a lion. It was a common motif used by several manufacturers. She turned the pages slowly, her focus absolute. The world had shrunk to the circle of light on her desk, the book, and the frantic beating of her own heart. She matched the drawing to the clerk's faint sketch. There it was, a crowned lion, its posture identical. The Penhurst Mill, Kent, a small but well-regarded producer of high-quality linen paper. For a moment, her hopes sank. A mill in Kent was plausible for the Duke's great-grandfather to have used. But then she read the text below the drawing. Her eyes scanned the history of the mill, its founding, its ownership, its notable clients. She read the first sentence. Then she read it again, her mind refusing to process the words. The Penhurst Mill, founded by Jonathan Croft, granted its royal charter in the year 1873. She froze, the book held open in her hands. The date on the supposedly damning letter from Alistair's great-grandfather was 1868. The paper it was written on had been manufactured by a mill that would not exist for another 5 years. It was impossible. A gasp escaped her lips, a small, sharp sound in the dead quiet of the room. She leaned back in her chair, the magnifying glass falling from her limp fingers and clattering onto the desk. It was over. The letter was a fake. The ink might be perfect, the signature flawless, but the paper was a ghost from the future. It was a simple, irrefutable, and beautiful mistake. The forger, in his quest for an authentic-looking script, had chosen a paper that was too high quality, too modern, its very existence an anachronism. A wave of feeling so powerful it almost knocked the breath from her lungs washed over Eleanor. It was triumph, pure and dizzying, but beneath it was something else, something deeper and far more startling. It was a profound, possessive joy. She had done it. She had found the key, the single flaw in their perfect lie. And in doing so, she had saved him. The image of his face, stripped of its arrogance and filled with despair, flashed in her mind. She had been the one to answer his call, and she had not failed. She had protected his legacy, his home, his name. The victory felt intensely personal, a secret bond forged in the crucible of this long, desperate night. She looked up. Through the large window, the first pale gray light of dawn was breaking over the London rooftops. The gas lamps outside looked tired and yellow, their vigil ending as a new day began. The city was stirring back to life. Eleanor sat there for a full minute, watching the sky slowly brighten from charcoal to a soft, hazy blue. She was utterly exhausted, her body aching with fatigue. But her mind was incandescent. She held the proof. She held his salvation in her hands. All thought of professional protocol, of formal letters and measured responses, vanished. The need to tell him, to erase the fear from his voice, was an urgent, overwhelming impulse. She stood, her movements stiff but resolute, and walked over to the small table where the telegraph forms were kept. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the impropriety of a direct message to a duke at this hour. She picked up a pen, her father's pen, and the ink flowed in a dark, certain line. Her message was not for the Duke of Blackwood. It was for Alistair. It was a shout of victory across the distance. 4 words, stark and absolute. Found it. The letter is a forgery. The carriage ride to Blackwood Manor felt different this time. There was no dread in her stomach, only a sharp current of triumph. Eleanor clutched the leather portfolio on her lap. Inside was the proof she had found after a sleepless night, the key to dismantling a lie. It was more than paper and ink. It was vindication. The butler greeted her with a new deference, leading her directly toward the Duke's study. The great oak doors swung open to reveal Alistair standing by the fireplace. He was not looking out the window as he had before. He was turned toward the door, waiting. Firelight softened the severe lines of his face. He looked tired, the skin around his eyes tight. But his usual mask of cold indifference was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded anticipation. He watched her approach in silence. The air in the room was charged with everything that had passed between them. Eleanor walked to the great oak desk and opened her portfolio with steady hands. She arranged the items on the polished wood, a photograph of the forged letter, a reference book open to a specific chapter, and finally 2 small paper samples taken from an envelope, placed directly under the desk lamp. "Your Grace," she began, her voice calm and clear. "The letter from the Tidwell estate is dated June of 1882. Alistair leaned forward, his intense eyes fixed on the evidence. "The forgery is masterful," she continued, "but the forger was an expert in handwriting, not in commerce. They made one fatal error." She pointed to the reference book. "The watermark on the paper is from the Abernathy Mill. That mill was destroyed by fire in 1885. It was rebuilt with new equipment and a new watermark in 1886. She then tapped one of the paper samples. "This letter uses paper with the new watermark. It is paper that did not exist until 4 years after the letter was supposedly signed." A heavy silence filled the room. Alistair stared at the evidence laid out before him. His hand reached out, his long fingers tracing the edge of the book as if to confirm it was real. For a long moment he was still. He was piecing together the victories she had just handed him. Then slowly he raised his head. His gaze lifted from the desk and met hers. The breath caught in Eleanor's throat. The cold wall she had been fighting against for weeks was gone. The look in his eyes was not just gratitude. It was a raw, unguarded awe that stripped away all rank and formality. He pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. He came around the desk, closing the space between them until he was standing just a few feet away. For the first time, she felt no intimidation, only the presence of the man himself, his defenses torn away. "I was wrong," he said, his voice low and raspy with emotion. "I was wrong, Eleanor." Her name, he said her name. It hung in the air between them, and her heart, once steady with professional pride, began to hammer against her ribs. She could only look at him, her own composure starting to fracture. "About everything, Jane," he continued, taking another small step. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "I saw a young woman and I made assumptions. I was arrogant and I was a fool." His voice was thick with a sincerity that shook her. "It is not just your mind, though it is sharper than any I have ever known. It is your spirit, your refusal to be dismissed, your fire. I have never met anyone like you." The words washed over her, a dizzying and beautiful recognition. He saw her completely, the woman who hid her vulnerability behind facts, the daughter who carried her father's legacy like a shield. An eternity seemed to pass in the space of a few heartbeats. He raised a hand slowly, hesitantly. Eleanor did not move as his fingers came closer, about to touch her cheek. Her lips parted on a breath she did not know she was holding. She waited for the contact she suddenly realized she had been longing for. But then he stopped. A shadow of conflict crossed his face. His jaw tightened. With a visible effort that seemed to cause him physical pain, he let his hand drop back to his side. The moment was broken, yet the charge between them remained, stronger and more intense than ever. The journey back to London was a blur of rolling hills and gray skies. Eleanor saw none of it. She had won, saving the Blackwood estate and earning the Duke's respect. But the victory felt hollow compared to the memory of his gaze. It was a look that had nothing to do with land rights or legal precedent. It was personal. It was Alistair looking at Eleanor. When she returned to her quiet apartment, the exhaustion she had held at bay for days washed over her. She sank into a chair, the silence a stark contrast to the storm inside her. The professional battle was over, but a more bewildering conflict had just begun. The next morning, the air in the offices of Vance and Comey was crisp. Eleanor sat at her desk, feeling a calm she had not known in months. The senior partners moved around her with a new deferential quiet. Their condescension had been replaced by a wary respect that was almost as irritating. At precisely 10 o'clock, a messenger delivered a thick envelope sealed with the Blackwood crest. Her heart gave a single hard thump. Inside, the formal letter was brief. It confirmed her firm would be retained as the exclusive legal counsel for the entire Blackwood estate. The contract was for 10 years. It was a victory far beyond her hopes. But it was the final sentence that made her breath catch. All correspondence and strategic consultations were to be directed personally and exclusively to Miss Eleanor Vance. She read the line again. He had handed her the crown in writing. A slow, genuine smile touched her lips. She picked up her father's pen, its weight solid in her palm. She had not just protected his legacy, she had built upon it. That afternoon, her clerk announced an unexpected visitor. Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, stood in her doorway. He was not in severe formality, but in a tweed jacket that made him seem younger. He looked out of place among her meticulously organized files, a piece of the windswept moors in the heart of the city. He stepped inside, his presence filling the room. His eyes scanned the space, then met hers. There was no trace of the cold, dismissive man she had first met. In his place was someone hesitant, searching. He was on her ground now, and the shift in power was a quiet hum in the air between them. He held a hat, turning the brim with a nervousness she found endearing. He did not mention the letter or the case. Instead, he gestured toward the window. "You have a fine view of the square," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Eleanor simply nodded, waiting. She knew this was not just a business meeting. He took a step closer, his piercing blue eyes holding hers. "Eleanor," he began, the name a soft caress. "I was wondering, would you walk with me in the park?" The question hung in the quiet office. It was an invitation to leave their prescribed roles behind. Her mind raced with a dozen reasons to say no. It was improper. It was unprofessional. But as she looked at him, at the quiet hope in his eyes, she could not refuse. She wanted to know the man beyond the title. "Yes, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady. "I would like that very much." They walked through St. James Park as the sun cast long shadows. For a long time they said nothing, the silence comfortable and companionable. Alistair finally broke it, his voice low. "I spent my life being taught that duty was everything," he said, looking at the ducks on the pond. "That my name was a fortress to be defended at all costs." He turned to her, his expression open and vulnerable. "You taught me that a fortress can also be a prison. You defended my legacy more fiercely than I ever could, not with stone walls, but with truth." Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was his real confession, his true apology. As they rounded a bend beneath the shade of an old oak tree, he stopped. He turned to face her fully, the dappled light playing across his serious face. He did not speak. He simply reached out and took her hand. This time, his touch was not hesitant. It was sure, his fingers closing around hers with a gentle firmness. A jolt, warm and definite, traveled up her arm. It was a current of recognition, of coming home. She did not pull away, her own fingers intertwined with his. It was a silent agreement, a promise sealed without a single word. They walked on as evening settled over the city, their joined hands a small, warm anchor in the cooling air.